think the Green New Deal is so significant. First of all, because it weds a bunch of environmental rules meant to kind of fight climate change with the promise of a job guarantee. The federal government's saying, we are going to give you a job if you don't have a job, if you're an American. If you look at the Democratic climate policy that would have preceded the Green New Deal, it would have been some version of a carbon tax. But on election day in November 2018, Washington State voted on a carbon tax referendum. And Washington State's like a very blue state. They elected a Democratic senator by like 59%. It's a state where outdoor activity is the kind of unofficial civic religion, and yet they rejected the carbon tax measure by 56%. And I think that defeat influenced a lot of people's thinking. Senator Merkley actually said it a few days ago. He said, if a carbon tax can't pass in Washington State, where can it pass? And I think that kind of got the wheels turning about, okay, well, what are things we could do on climate change that aren't a carbon tax? There's a UN 1.5 report from a few months ago that said we need to cut carbon emissions by 65%, I think, by 2030 in order to only hit 1.5 degrees C of warming by the end of the century. And I think the idea behind the Green New Deal is, well, what would it take to actually do that? Like, what would that look like? What Democrats want is a version of Medicare for all for climate change. Medicare for all is so easy to run on because people like Medicare, they know what Medicare means, or they have an idea of what it means, and they know how their lives would be different if they had it. Democrats want a version of that for climate change. And they also want a version of it for a lot of the other issues that are important to them. And I think Green New Deal is where that's coming from, and because of that, there's potential for it to get tied up into all sorts of lefty policies that may not be as popular. If you look at the original New Deal, right, one of the goals of the original New Deal was to rearm Britain, was to build infrastructure across the United States. All these things that at that point the Democrats wanted to do anyway. But they did not sell the New Deal as here's a bunch of things we want to do anyway. They sold it as we're going to help you and we're going to try everything we can to help you. And along the way we might do things we want to do anyway. The Green New Deal is being sold a little differently. It's being sold as we're going to do the things we want to do and along the way we're going to help you. So the kind of messaging is reversed. And I think that could wind up really hurting Democrats as they try to build support for the Green New Deal idea. Democrats were elected in 1992. So if you look at, so what matters in federal lawmaking, right, is having the trifecta, having the House, the Senate, and the White House. That means you can pass bills and turn them into law, theoretically. That's how you get the most change done. And Democrats have had it twice in my lifetime, actually. The first was in 1992, coming out of the recession, when they tried to pass the BTU tax, which would have functioned somewhat like a carbon tax. It certainly could have been adapted in climate-friendly ways. It didn't pass because everyone was skittish about passing a new energy tax after a recession. In 2009, which is the second time Democrats have had a governing trifecta in my lifetime, they looked at cap and trade. And that was the big climate bill. It was a major priority. It passed out of the House, just like the BTU tax did. And it didn't get through the Senate because ultimately, again, people, like lawmakers, were worried about passing an energy tax in the middle of coming out of a recession, or at that point in the middle of a recession. And so all the really elegant climate policies that economists like a lot take the form of a tax. And that's nice because it means things are paid for. I mean, it's there's good, smart governing reasons for it. But it's really hard to pass a new tax just after a recession. And if you look at Democratic prospects for getting a trifecta in the next 2 to 6 years, it's pretty likely that they'll govern, that the next time they govern will be in a recession as a country, or will be just after one. I mean, that's kind of how you can see the White House switching hands, or the Senate switching hands, for that matter. And the good part of a Green New Deal is it looks like a stimulus. The New Deal is like the most famous stimulus in American history. And so the Green New Deal does not look like a new tax, even if it does contain some new taxes. It is thought of, I mean, it's a new deal, it's a stimulus. And so I think in that way it kind of represents creative lawmaking, in that it seems a whole lot easier like to pass national climate legislation if it looks like a stimulus rather than if it looks like a new tax. Like the New Deal was originally like, we're going to help you. That's our first goal. And on the way to helping you, we're going to do things like rearming Britain that we want to do. And then the Green New Deal, the pitch is, we're going to do things we want to do, and on the way it's going to help you. And the difference in rhetoric there, I think, could wind up being a problem for Democrats.